So I'm going to suggest that we start, if that's okay with all folks. Welcome, everybody. We have a good number of people, 34 today. Appreciate it. Jake, you can stop the screen share and we'll kick it off. My name is Hugh Taft-Morales. Welcome, everybody. I serve as the leader of the Baltimore and Ethical Society and the Philadelphia Ethical Society, and I'll be moderating this salon and throwing in my 2 cents now and then. This evening, sponsored by the Ethical Action Committee of the American Ethical Union. I want to thank Carolyn Parker, Chair of the Ethical Action Committee, and others on the committee for their help in framing tonight's program, and for Jake Ritter for being our tech helper, and Bart for helping out in that regard. More personally, I'll say I want to thank my children and Paula Rochelle and Alan Miner-Berger and others for their support in my own transition towards a more fully plant-based diet, which is just one behavioral shift that flows from a sentientist perspective. But I want to particularly thank our 2 guests for tonight. Jake can throw those bios in the chat, but Amy Halpern-Laff is a lifelong humanist, a member of the Ethical Society of Silicon Valley. She's also Director, Policy and External Relations for Factory Farming Awareness Coalition, and the Co-Executive Director of Ethics in Action Network. Jamie Woodhouse, all the way from Britain, after midnight, is developing the Sentientism as a philosophy and global movement. He hosts the Sentientism podcast and YouTube, and has published articles, presented academic seminars on the topic, and is building a range of global Sentientism communities open to everybody that so far span over 100 countries. And you can find him on Twitter at Jamie Woodhouse and at Sentientism. I'll add, before we jump into things, that Sentientism includes issues of artificial intelligence, something of great interest to me, but tonight we're focusing on biological animals. I hope that the evening might lead some of you to join with Amy in drafting up a resolution that we might put forward before the American Ethical Union at our annual meeting. And if you're interested, please email Amy at ethicalschools.org. And I'm throwing that into the chat right now. Again, that is to Amy at ethicalschools.org if you'd like to be involved in a group drawing up a potential resolution that flows out of sentientism. Now, during the presentations, you can put questions into the chat when I ask you to do, because if you put it in the middle of the discussion, it'll get lost in the chat, it'll scroll up. So write down your questions and get ready to put them in the chat when I prompt you. If you please wait for that, it'll be helpful and you'll get your question asked. Near the end of the event, we will have 20 minutes for spoken questions from the floor. So if you want to get a little bit more personally engaged in your question, you can wait to the last 20 minutes. So you know, the flow of tonight is a short presentation with some clarifying questions, just like a 5-minute presentation, a couple of questions to clarify what the main idea of sentientism is, then a main presentation by Amy and Jamie, and then a question and answer. And in the middle of the Q&A, before we go to the verbal questions, I'm going to throw a few ideas, reactions to the presentations, and a couple of thoughts about my own path towards veganism. And we'll close at 9:30. So if you have to leave before that, we understand, but hopefully you can hang out. And finally, before letting Jamie and Amy present, I want to reiterate that the evening is meant more to be about understanding than convincing, and more about support than debate. Let's bring out our best in that regard. This is a learning evening, and we're hoping that we can all see how we can look to ways that we can grow, think of new ways of viewing things. So Jamie and Amy will begin with this very brief description of the basic meaning of sentientism, and then we'll take some clarifying questions. Jamie, you're gonna start us off there and then hand it off to Amy for the brief intro.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Hugh. And it's such a pleasure to be with you all this evening. So I really appreciate the invite. Looking forward to the discussion. So I'd summarize sentientism in one sentence as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. But even before that, you might say, well, what is sentientism? I describe it as a worldview or a philosophy, a way of thinking about the world. And in a way, it's trying to answer the 2 deepest, and I think the most important philosophical questions. What's real? What should we believe about the world? And what matters and who counts in our ethics, in our morality? So the evidence and reason part, in common with secular humanism and many aspects of ethical culture, it suggests we should take a methodologically naturalistic approach, using evidence and reason to form credences or beliefs, always with humility and holding those beliefs as though they're provisional, always open to new evidence, and probabilistic. We weight our belief based on the quality of the evidence. So that's how it answers the what's real question, use evidence and reason. When it comes to the equally critical question of who gets to count in ethics, who matters, the clue is in the name, and it is a little bit difficult to pronounce. So the best pronunciation guide really is to use the word sentient and just add ism on the end. And that's how it answers that who matters question. It says every sentient being should get to count in our moral consideration, should get our compassion. And sentience, the simplest way of understanding it really is to go back to Jeremy Bentham when he said, the question is, can they suffer? Sentience is the capacity to have experiences at all. As all of you and I are right now, every moment, we're having experiences that we might describe the negative ones as suffering and the positive ones as flourishing. So any being that's capable of experiencing anything at all, we should give them our compassion and our moral consideration. It has roots that are very deep and ancient. So as you will all know, naturalistic thinking goes back thousands of years into many different cultures, Greek, Arabic. There are naturalistic roots in Indian and Asian cultures that predate all religions. You might even argue that naturalistic thinking goes back before humanity itself, in that non-human animals are, in a sense, building beliefs and understanding of the world using evidence and reason. They're probably not fabricating too much in their understanding of the world, simple though it might be. So the naturalistic side, evidence and reason, has deep and ancient and global roots. This isn't a recent invention. And the same is true of the sentiocentric side, this caring for all beings that can suffer. And again, you can see the roots of that thought in Arabic thought, in Greek thought. It's certainly in the concept of ahimsa that runs through many of the Eastern religions. And again, I'd argue that this sense of compassion, at least the proto-morality behind that, you could argue is even pre-human. Humans weren't the first beings to feel compassion. I think non-human animals, long before we arrived on the scene, surely felt compassion for their own offspring, their own young. So again, deep and ancient roots. And I'd close this opening discussion of what sentientism is by answering the question, why do I think it's an important idea? Why are worldviews important? And in a sense, it feels to me that almost every human-caused problem we might think of as we look around the world, when you dig down, comes from one of two root causes. One is simply a failure of compassion, that we've excluded some being from our moral consideration. We don't care about them. We don't have compassion for them. That causes problems all through human ethics, but also beyond. So it's either a failure of compassion, or it's simply just getting something wrong about the world, believing something that isn't true. And either of those things, I think, can cause problems. So if we can have a worldview that can give us a better chance of having accurate beliefs, the naturalism, and we can have a worldview that has a compassion that includes any being that can possibly suffer, that seems to give us a more solid foundation to try and make the world a better place. So that's how I'd conclude the sort of opening statement about what sentientism is. Amy, is there anything you'd add to that introduction? Because I know you're going to kick off our second section of the presentation, but is there anything else you'd add in here that I've missed?
I'd just like to add, to bring this home to ethical culture, because in our societies, we talk about humanism as affirming our ability and our responsibility as humans to lead ethical lives. And I think what we're suggesting tonight is that as humans, we have the ability and the responsibility to work toward the greater good, not just of humanity, but of all beings who can suffer and thrive, and to expand what I tend to call our universe of obligation.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And I think that's why the concepts actually go very well together, because as most people know, humanism isn't just about caring about humans. It's about humans being, I guess, the center of responsibility in terms of defining, framing ethics. But it doesn't restrict our compassion just to humans. So in a way, sentientism is quite naturally saying, let's build on that human responsibility for ethics and think about the scope of our responsibility. And that's where the name of sentientism comes from, isn't who's responsible, it's who gets that compassion. Yeah, no, that's a great link. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Jamie. So my idea was to allow people to ask some clarifying questions about the basic idea. If there's something that Jamie or Amy said just now that didn't make sense to you, or you wanted to know a little bit more about, go ahead and put it in the chat. I'm going to monitor that. And it may be a mistake. This was my idea because they're going to go into sentientism in detail. But is there anything that you want to ask off the bat, sort of big picture about sentientism? I'll take the first one as people are perhaps scratching them in. Where did you first hear sentientism as a term, the both of you? Where was the first time that you sort of heard that this was something? Because it's relatively new for me.
You want to start, Amy? And because I can go a little bit into the history of the term itself, but I don't know if you want to share where you first heard of it.
You go ahead, because I'm drawing a blank. I don't know where I
So I first heard of it probably about 5 or 6 years ago, when I started looking more seriously into moral philosophy and animal ethics in particular. So the word was first used in the 1970s, actually as a criticism of the field of animal ethics that was developing at the time. So there were a group of people, including Bridget Brophy, and then later Peter Singer, Richard Ryder, Ros Godlovich, and others, who were building on some earlier ideas, including ahimsa, including work of people like Henry Salt, who will be familiar to many ethical culture people, who had already laid out this idea that we should care about other beings that can suffer beyond humans. And the first time it was used was actually as a criticism, of saying it's not going far enough. We should, as I know Carl's done a talk recently on, talk about biocentrism or ecocentrism. So it came out of that formalized thinking about animal ethics and why and which animals we should care about. So in essence, what I've done is try to take that term and modernize it. The people who were talking about it originally did use it in a naturalistic sense, because they were thinking about the science of sentience and consciousness and animal biology. But I've taken that naturalism and broadened it out to say it should include a naturalistic understanding of all reality, not just our naturalistic understanding of sentience. And the other thing I've done is, where people like Peter Singer, who many of you will know, took it in a particular direction towards, for example, utilitarianism as a particular ethical system, I've suggested that sentientism should be ethically neutral, in that it just says we should have compassion for all sentient beings, but it doesn't specify which ethical system you should then apply. So you could then use a virtue ethics approach, or a rules approach, or a utility approach, or a consequentialist approach, or a feminist care ethic, or there's so many different systems you could apply. In a sense, sentientism now is saying it doesn't really matter as long as you have moral consideration for all sentience. So that's a long answer of where I first heard of it, but I guess how I've tried to modernize the idea.
Let me throw two questions from the chat that sort of are related. Chris from the Triangle Societies asked whether sentientism differentiates between pain and suffering. And related to that, Chuck from Philadelphia said, what determines if a being suffered? Because there's some evidence now, he points out, that plants are aware of each other, can communicate, react to changes in their environment. What makes us think that they don't suffer? Maybe you do.
Yeah, so on the first question, that's really interesting, because there's quite a lot of technical biological analysis of, how our experiences happen. And there's quite a lot of, there's so much still to understand. We don't yet have a full, complete understanding of our sentience and our experiences. But most scientists will differentiate to some degree between pain as a response to a particular stimulus and suffering as the more rounded negative experience that might be a result of pain. So sometimes people talk about pain and suffering as if they're the same thing, but sometimes technically there is a slight distinction between, a negative response, a nociception of a negative stimulus, and suffering, which is a much broader term of just experiencing something negative, which might be a pain, but it could also be existential angst, a sense of loss, a sense of it can be anything negative. So that's how I think of the difference between pain and suffering. And the second question is really important, and sentientism doesn't directly answer it, because sentientism doesn't say here's a list of the beings or the species or the types of things that are sentient. It just says take a naturalistic approach and follow the science. So science tends to take three main lines of inference when we're trying to work out whether a being is sentient or not. And most would start from, if you like, a personal experience. I know I'm pretty confident I'm sentient. You can then say, well, I'm fairly confident all the other people on this call are sentient because we are of the same species. We're probably running the same sort of hardware and software. We have a similar evolutionary history. Your behavior and communications is very similar to me. So that gives me a very good level of confidence that most of the people on this call are sentient. But you can take those lines of evidence, the biological history and drivers, the information processing architecture and, the neural architecture, if you like, the nervous systems, and behavior and communications. And from those, you can infer with pretty good confidence whether other non-human animals are sentient and suffer as well. It's not perfect, but then science never is. So
Right.
Well, let me add something, which is that we're learning. And I mean, that's the nature of science, right? Science isn't a collection of facts, it's a process. And we can only use the best that we have right now. And I certainly would argue that when we don't know, let's err on the side of caution and assume that animals are sentient. Yeah, I think that if we look at someone like John Dewey, who said that as science develops, we should change our behaviors and our customs, then it makes sense to me that we should look at our habits and the way we treat animals, both domesticated animals and wild animals, and perhaps alter our habits.
Right.
Yeah.
So
and it might be worth that can seem an irritatingly neutral answer in a way, because we're saying just follow the science. But my sense of the current scientific consensus is that essentially humans are sentient. You'll be glad to hear. So you'll get compassion in this system. But essentially all vertebrate animals are also sentient. But it seems that there's good evidence that many of the invertebrates are sentient as well.
Right.
So some of the more complex insects, cephalopods, decapods, octopuses, for example, lobsters, many of the crustaceans, all seem to have some degree of sentience. They may differ in degree, they may differ in richness, but there all seems to be good evidence. With the simpler invertebrates, the really simple insects, it's more of an open question and less certain. With the super simplest animals, like a sea sponge, it has no nervous system at all. So I think we can be pretty confident they're not sentient. And the current scientific consensus around plants is, while their behavior could be very rich and complex, and they can communicate, through fungal networks, and there's so much more amazing work to do there, it doesn't at this point seem that they have the required degree of centralization of a nervous system that seems to be required for experience. So the behavior can be quite complex, but it doesn't seem at this stage of our knowledge that plants are likely to have any experiences themselves. So, a plant might be harmed and it might reach for the sunlight, but there's nothing going on that suggests that it's feeling the warmth of the sun or that it minds when we cut a leaf off. But again,
Thanks for that.
We're learning.
And we're going to take a deep dive in just a minute, but I just wanted to add that I was in graduate school in the mid 80s. And it was just at that point that I noticed a sort of sea change in a lot of the philosophy. I was reading Mary Midgley and a number of other people. And there was a real surge in understanding of animal behavior and animal consciousness that has taken about 20 to 30 years to become mainstream in a way, but I saw the ripples there. So why don't we go to your main presentation? And I think Amy was going to start us off, is that correct?
Yeah.
And just so people know, this will go about 30 minutes and then we'll have time for questions. So please write your questions down, but don't put them in the chat until I prompt you at the end. Thanks, Amy.
Okay, I'm actually going to start with what we can do about it. Okay, once we stipulate that animals other than humans are sentient beings, or to the extent that we know that they are. So I think we can We can advocate both as individuals, as ethical culture societies, and then as a movement. So I'm going to look at those areas. Certainly, we can be more intentional in our own lives about what we eat and what we wear. We can educate our friends and our colleagues about the devastating impacts of animal agriculture on animal suffering, including human suffering. And as engaged citizens, we can advocate for legislation in our respective cities and states. As ethical culture societies, we should ensure that the foods we procure or prepare have minimal impact on the planet, on humans, on animals other than humans, and especially on the day that we convene and reaffirm our values, typically Sunday, we can serve or share only plant-based food. I call that Green Sundays. And we can start that with once or twice a month. As a movement, we can lead. Ethical culture has been on the forefront of important social movements. I mean, 50 years from now, we're going to look back on the way we treat animals, both factory farmed animals and wild animals, as one of our worst moral failings. Let's expand our role, our circle of compassion right now, beginning with a resolution. Jamie?
And who is it that's supporting you with the barks in the background? What's the name of your?
That's actually, I'm embarrassed to say that's my telephone that's barking.
Ah.
My dog, Zach, is right here. This is the Zactivist.
Thank you. Hello, Zach. Jamie?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think there's probably two ways I'd describe how we can put this type of idea into practice. Just to layer that onto what Amy said. One is, if you think about, okay, what campaigns might flow from this way of thinking, in a sense, it maps to every campaign that a humanist or a humanitarian or an ethical culture group might want to be driving anyway, in terms of resisting discrimination, fighting for justice, every social justice cause, humanitarian causes, thinking about the problems of those who are disadvantaged or struggling with poverty or global health. So that full list of, I guess, classical humanist ethical campaigns, a sentientist perspective would wholeheartedly endorse, because let's not forget, all of us humans are sentient beings too. So we warrant compassion ourselves and all other humans. So it adds to those campaigns and reinforces them. But what it does do, as Amy's described there, is that we need to layer into that this compassion for other beings that seem to be sentient as well. And you can group them in different ways. Amy has Zach on her lap, so our companion animals and the animals we already see within our families are a really easy place to start, because in a sense, we know they are individuals. We know they can suffer and flourish, and we already include them in our moral consideration. So that's a really powerful starting point, is to think about the non-human animals we already share our lives with, and often just consider them a natural part of our families. But to be consistent in their ethics, and I think we do all want to be consistent, if we're going to recognize the moral salience and the moral value of the dog on our lap or the cat at our feet, as Amy said, you've got to think more broadly about where other beings might be that are sentient. So some people will talk about the liminal animals that live in and around human civilization. Some we look on kindly, some we describe as vermin. A sentientist view would say, inconvenient or not, they all warrant some compassion. Doesn't mean there might not be difficult trade-offs we have to play in, but as we think about how to live with them and in and around them, we should have some consideration for them. There are wild animals. Typically, we think of the wild animals that we see on our nature programs, the charismatic wild animals, the ones we love to revere and consider. Those are a vanishingly small percentage of the wild animals that really are out there. I mean, there aren't any good estimates of the number of wild animals, but it's probably in the quadrillions of sentient animals in the wild. So again, that might seem a little daunting to have compassion for all of them and moral consideration for them, but the fact it feels daunting, I don't think is an excuse for, at least in theory, trying and bearing them in mind as we work out how to do good in the world. And one of the most sensitive and critical groups of non-human animals, of course, is those we farm and fish for our own ends. And again, that's a fundamental shift in our campaigning and also in our ethics, is to imagine their perspective in those processes. And that leads you, as we're going to talk about later on, to probably one of the most central, maybe more challenging shifts in perspective and in behavior that we need to take. The other thing I think we can do is we can actually reuse a lot of the amazing thinking that humanists and others driving humanitarian causes are already working on. So it's an interesting thought experiment to look at, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and think about what that might look like, rewritten as a Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights. We can look at the Sustainable Development Goals and think, well, wouldn't it be interesting to rewrite those from the perspective of all sentient beings, not just from the perspective of humans wanting a healthy planet to live on? We can think about our politics, as Amy said, at a local level, what we're doing through AEU or our local groups or our local political organizations or national political organizations or all the way up to the UN. What would those suites of policies and laws and regulations look like if we took a much broader sentientist perspective? And in softer terms, what would our justice campaigns look like? What would our language use be like? So it's quite interesting to just think through all of the wonderful things that we're working on that are still incomplete in terms of human and social justice, and just consider how those might change and shift if we push this boundary even further. And so that's in terms of thinking about, okay, what would a suite of campaigns look like if you expanded them from a humanist to a sentientist perspective? But then there's all of the different levers we can pull. So there's clearly decisions we can take in our own life. And I think a strong starting point that we would take as a humanist is at least try not to cause needless harm to other humans. And a sentientist perspective would also say, let's at least try not to cause needless harm to other sentient beings, which personally leads me, as you hinted at, Hugh, to veganism, which in simple terms is just trying not to cause harm and suffering where we can, where it's practical and possible. But there are also all sorts of different roles that we can play individually, not just in our own personal life, the way we interact with other people, the way we interact with other animals with kindness and compassion and consideration, but through the influences we can have on different institutions. So again, groups like this, our role as a voter, our role as a consumer, our role as a manager or a leader or an employee of a company, petitioners, letter writers, our involvement in democratic politics as well. So just as with an ethical culture or a humanist perspective, you don't just think, how do I behave moment to moment, but what influence can I have in terms of the example I set and the influence I play through into all of the different institutions. Exactly the same mindset can give you all sorts of different levers you can pull to try and make things a better world from a sentientist perspective too. And each of us has to recognize that we all have very different degrees of resources in time, mental space, money, in terms of which of those levers we can pull, privilege. So some of us might not be able to do much and others might be in a lucky position to do a great deal. But whoever we are, I think we shouldn't underestimate the ripples that can spread out from our work. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the sort of range of campaigns that a sentientist outlook might lay out. And again, we can go into more detail there if people are interested. Some of them are quite obvious. Some of them lead us to some, frankly, very difficult ethical challenges where there are no easy answers. But in terms of the levers we can pull, in terms of activism and campaigns and the effect we can have on the world, in a sense, it's the same toolkit as an ethical culture group and secular humanists might use too.
I do think the first step is reaching some sort of consensus as an organization, as a movement, because once we agree that this is something we need to do, I think we can do it. I mean, ethical culture people know how to do movements. Yeah, and anyone who's interested in various types of citizen lobbying, I can certainly help with that. I write quite a bit of legislation and some of it passes and some of it doesn't, but but it matters. And the great thing about citizen lobbying is that even if you don't get what you want, you're raising awareness and educating people all along the way. So it's never wasted.
Yeah. And if it's, I mean, if it's useful, you know, Amy and I can sort of share some specific examples of the types of campaigns that people with the sentientist mindset are running, if that's useful to sort of bring it to life.
Sure.
So one that's closer to you all than me is being driven in Oregon at the moment, where they have a ballot initiative called IP13. And this is a very simple idea. I was lucky enough to interview David Mickelson, who's the petitioner who's driving the campaign. I know not all US states have this in their constitution, but Oregon and I know a number of others do, where if you can get a certain number of signatures from any citizen, you can put a motion on a ballot, normally tied up with a wider election cycle. So while you're voting for a governor or school boards or so on, this question will also be on the ballot if there's enough support from signatures to put it on there. So the question that David is suggesting gets asked of the people of Oregon in the next election cycle is a really simple one. It says, we currently have, for example, animal cruelty legislation that says it's a bad thing to needlessly harm another sentient being, but there are a number of exclusions that basically carve out all of animal farming, all of animal testing and research, and essentially any other area where human beings just happen to want to use animals for their own ends. So in essence, that might constrain you if you're going to be cruel to a pet, for example, but it does almost nothing for the vast majority of animals in the wild or in farms. So the question that's being asked through that ballot initiative is very simple, which is, should we remove exemptions from animal cruelty laws? Now that sounds like a very simple question with a very obvious answer, but the implications again are quite radical of that shift, because essentially it would render Oregon a sanctuary state where it becomes illegal to without really good cause, i.e. in the animal's own interest, killing an animal or harming an animal, which essentially renders the end of animal farming. So there's one quite extreme example, if you like, a simple example, but a live one that's being pushed at the moment of an initiative that is highly likely to fail, but hopefully we'll get millions more people thinking about this fundamental shift to consider the perspective of non-human animals as victims. There's a similar initiative being worked on in Switzerland at the moment, which is more focused on factory farming. So it's more targeted on industrial farming rather than all farming. But yeah,
sorry, and
Amy, go.
And we have here in the States the Farm Systems Reform Act. That's Cory Booker's bill. Hasn't passed yet. It might, but that's the idea of phasing out factory farms over time, preventing new ones and mergers. Out here in California, we have some interesting bills. One is what we call the Farm Transformation Bill. So it's the idea of the government providing resources so that ranchers and dairy farmers can switch to something, some other sort of farming, growing crops to feed humans. That's transformation. Unfortunately, there was one bill that seemed so obvious to pass, and it was a ban on the state of California procuring products from the Amazon rainforest. And it did pass both houses, but then Governor Newsom vetoed it for reasons not entirely clear, but we suspect it came from the paper lobby. The problems with that are several, although when these forests are raised, typically the trees are originally the lumber is used for paper, but then we have ranches in the rainforest. Okay, and so aside from the fact that the rainforest is, as we know, the lungs of the planet, we need rainforest. We also don't need domesticated animals coming into contact with wild animals. It's, a terrible idea from animal health perspective, from human health perspective, and certainly for the wild animals. And this is their habitat. So I like to promote education, and not just education at schools, although I think that's important, but public education. And a lot of it is, and people can understand why it's a good idea not to eat animals, or certainly to significantly reduce the animal products that they consume. But the questions, the misunderstandings, I would say, that come up over and over again is that being vegan is expensive. Vegan food doesn't taste good. Vegan food cannot be culturally familiar, right? So people have all sorts of attachments to food that they've had for generations. And as I like to say, anything you can cook, I can cook vegan. So I think that's true. Okay, cost, taste. I'll think of the fourth one. Taste. Well, let's go on. I'll come back.
Okay. Well, why don't we go to questions now that people can put in the chat? I've got a couple already, and I'll share them now. And to let you know, I'm going to talk about the personal struggles that I went through to get towards veganism. So we'll get into the personal questions a little bit more later. But Jan from the Ethical Humanist Society, the Triangle, said, where do you draw the line in using animals as service dogs, helping a person in need, versus a donkey pulling carts in a mine, for example? Any response to that?
Yeah, so one thing, you will find an enormous diversity of different views amongst people who call themselves sentientists, because, as I said, all it is saying we should have moral consideration for non-human animals. It doesn't tell you, specifically what to do as a result of that. So there are some sentientists who will say that there should be no form of animal exploitation whatsoever, and I'd probably agree with that. But to my mind, personally, I think that does leave the door open for us to collaborate and cooperate with service animals in certain contexts. And I can imagine that they may well have a positive experience, a sense of meaning, contribution, and a sense of community out of doing that work. So, I wouldn't close the door to it completely, but I would say that we need to genuinely have that perspective shift of imperfectly imagining what it's really like to live a life as that animal, and make sure that we're comfortable that their quality of life and their engagement is something that's positive for them. I think that's a really important check to put in place. So I think, no to exploitation, but that doesn't mean we can't collaborate and work together across species in certain ways. But let's be careful.
So one question was difference between vegan and vegetarian. And for my mind, it means that vegans don't eat anything that is animal products, so milk, cheese, or the animal, whereas a vegetarian will eat food that animals produce. So milk and cheese are the major ones.
I think that's a good summary. I would go a little bit further. So I think vegetarian is more about diet in a sense, because it's saying, I won't put essentially flesh or a dead animal in my mouth. Whereas veganism is more of a philosophical stance. It's more saying we will do what I can to avoid needlessly causing harm and suffering of any kind. So that does mean, turning away from dairy and eggs and, and other products that require the suffering or killing of animals in a direct sense. But it's not. It's not just food. It's it's any product or any consumption choice too. So in a sense, it's a philosophical boycott of any product that requires the suffering, the direct suffering or death of an animal.
Right. And we are going to go to hands in the last 20 minutes for folks that know. Right now, I'm taking questions in the chat. And the next one is, how do you relate to dangerous animals like rats or bugs, or for malaria or Lyme disease, ticks?
That's tough, and I don't think there's a perfect answer. Let me just return to the last question that to which I couldn't finish the answer. The fourth objection that I hear a lot is that I can't be healthy on a plant-based diet. So it's a nutritional question. And I would disagree. And I think that most knowledgeable nutritionists would disagree. There are a few supplements that you should probably take as a vegan to be sure you're getting enough vitamin B12, for instance, but certainly it can be very healthy on a plant-based diet. Okay, next question. Well, unfortunately, we saw one response to animals that we don't like to have around, and that was from the New York Mayor, Eric Adams, who in many ways has been wonderful so far in terms of vegan Fridays in the schools and vegan meals in hospitals, those sorts of things. On the other hand, he had some sort of product that kind of dissolved rats. And, rats are sentient animals, obviously, and that's just not something I could condone. We look at these issues, and I'm not sure that either Jamie or I have very specific, pragmatic answers to these questions. What do you do when you have roaches in your closet? What do you do? I know my mom right now has a mouse issue, and the mice seem to be eating Teddy Grahams, something like that, or at least nesting in them. So, it's not that we have the answers, it's that we say that sentience matters, okay? So when we think about how we're going to solve these issues in our homes and in our communities, let's keep in mind that we're not the only ones who have fear of those animals, who are, can be annoyed, our lives can be disrupted. It's true of other animals as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So
on the danger, a quick point on the dangerous.
If you could just add to this in it, so the dangers of those, the certain animals that take us, and then also the positives of using animals for pharmaceutical agents, other scientific research that will, in some cases, deeply reduce human suffering.
Yeah. So on the dangerous animals, Amy's right. There often isn't an easy answer or a perfect answer. But as long as we have compassion for every sentient being in that situation, we're more likely to find a more compassionate way through. Whereas if we immediately classify them as vermin or dangerous, quite often the human answer is just by default, kill them all. And maybe that's the only option, but often there is a better way forward. And I think a good analogy sometimes is to think about, well, how do we deal with dangerous humans? We don't exclude them from our moral consideration. We don't say they're meaningless. We don't, arbitrarily harm them, but we do recognize that if they're likely to cause harm to others, it's absolutely justifiable to constrain them, to maybe rehabilitate them, to put them somewhere where they're not going to hurt others. So I think we can take that similar approach with dangerous animals. We're absolutely justified in, constraining them, harming them, maybe even in extremis killing them, if it's to avoid egregious, serious harm in other situations. But we still have to have a philosophical compassion for, even dangerous humans and dangerous animals, and hopefully that will make it more likely we can find a compassionate way through. But compassion doesn't mean, it doesn't have to mean weakness or appeasement, or we just, give our houses over to invasive, species, or we let a harmful human do whatever they like to us, right? Quite often compassion can justify, constraining and having negative impact on others.
So spraying for termites or having a mosquito zapper, that would be.
Maybe. I mean, hopefully if you have the moral consideration for them, you're more likely to investigate other approaches. Could you use a net? Could you use a gene drive? Could you use, do something else that doesn't cause direct suffering? But in extremis, maybe there isn't another option. You will find a justification to cause harm too.
Right.
Some of the questions in the chat are fascinating. Like, what about using a cat to catch rodents? There's a bit of a sort of a, somehow does that give us ethical an ethical voucher that we get away with that because it's the natural world.
Right. And we're not going to come up with the specific
Right.
conclusions that anyone should come to. It's just a matter of considering that animals other than human can thrive, they can suffer. Let's take that into consideration when we determine our actions. And from a Deweyan perspective, there's a lot that we didn't know, that especially that former generations didn't know about animal sentience. So let's think about that and perhaps not be so quick to kill the mosquitoes or to dissolve the rats.
And I think that's a really important thing. Even if we come to the conclusion that causing harm is justified in some sense, that doesn't mitigate the suffering of the victim.
Right.
And that's true of a rat being killed by a cat. It's true of what we might do to animals that we don't want in our houses. We might be able to justify something, but that does not mitigate what the experience of the other being is going through. That's what we need to bear in mind as we try and work through some of these tricky topics. And I think one of the things is to examine, is this actually a problem? Or is this just something we're intuitively reacting to as negative? Can we share the space? Can we find a more collaborative way forward? It may not be a way forward, but let's at least be motivated to try and think more compassionately.
Yeah, that brings up, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Amy. No, go ahead.
I was going to say that brings up 2 points from me. One is this, recently deceased E.O. Wilson had the idea of giving back half the earth to the animal. And whether or not that's realistic, I do think we need to think long and hard about appropriating territory that historically has belonged to animals other than humans. And there's just, where we build our bridges, where we, what kinds of land we take over. In the East Bay, we have a turkey issue. Maybe we shouldn't be building a shopping center where in the Turkish territory. I mean, let's take these things into consideration. And taking that even one step further, taking that one step further, I'm a firm believer in wild animal welfare. And a lot of people think that that is intractable. After all, we have predators and prey. Mm-hmm. But there's some things we have done that we do for animals already. For example, we sterilize feral cats, right? So I'm not so quick to think that there is nothing that we can do, that there's nothing science will help us do over time to relieve some of the suffering in the wild.
So a lot of the questions in the chat, Jamie answered some of the questions there, have to do with diet and how we substitute vegan and vegetarian foods for foods that are high in protein. All of you on this call tonight will be getting an email within 48 hours is what I'm promising. And if you don't get it, email me, hughtm@gmail.com, which will have some information that might help you learn how to move towards a vegan or vegetarian diet so that your health can be maintained. Because it is tricky, it's not easy. It is a lot easier to be a vegetarian than it is to be a vegan. You have to be more careful as a vegan if you're not having milk and cheese and yogurt, but you can do it. It's perfectly easy, but talk to your doctor is the first thing, and some guides will come. Other things about that before I share a little bit, Amy or Jamie?
I just want to mention, because I don't think it's come up yet, is when I became vegan, the first thing that I cut out was milk, was dairy. And that's because I'm a mom. And the whole concept of, confiscating a baby within 48 hours so that, humans can appropriate the milk that was intended for that baby, it's just so horrendous. It's so unthinkable. So for me, that was, at least emotionally, the easiest thing to cut out.
Right.
So, but you're right that this should be all be done very intentionally, especially if people have underlying health conditions. So yeah. And
I do want to underline one fact that I heard, which some people said in the chat, and that house cats and feral cats kill incredible amount of birds,
Yeah.
more than they kill of rodents, and it's very dangerous. So it's one reason to argue that if you're going to have a cat, to have an indoor cat and to put up with their claws, because declawing is torturous. It terrifies me. And I didn't get to all the questions, but you'll be able to ask them as we move on. I think one of the things that I wanted to share a little bit about was in ethical culture. One of the comments there was, how do you pick what you do to try to be ethical? And I think one of the things that Jamie and Amy are saying is that it's not easy to be an ethical person. We all, myself included, create harm in our lives. And I think for me, the biggest difference was to not do it with a sense of righteousness or ethical brutality in a way that I know that I do harm. It reminds me a little bit of the story that I was told, and maybe you got told too in your social studies class, how many indigenous people thank the animals that they take and use in a way. And to me, that is a form of admitting that what you're doing is perhaps harmful, or you're somehow making a gesture towards the animal that you're taking for your life. And clearly it's different for indigenous folks that don't have the options. For those of us who live a life of relative comfort and who have resources, it's so much easier to be vegetarian or vegan in some ways because we have those options. But I admit that changing dietary habits can be very challenging. And these are my personal reasons why it was so challenging when I thought about this. And Amy mentioned one earlier. One is that we create community and sanctify our eating with culturally inherited habits through rituals. We might say grace at our meals or words of thanks for the food that we're about to eat. And these moments of reverence are wrapped around our food choices, and they can lead us instinctually and aggressively to defend these habits and these choices that we make in our nutrition. And I just wanted to try to be more intentional about, okay, what is it about the food that I eat, that turkey, that at Thanksgiving that comes out, which I defended for many years until about 4 or 5 years ago, when I began to transition away, and my son made an incredible nut vegan mushroom loaf that was as big as a turkey. But we also reinforce this because we eat together. We bound our communities and our families together when we meet to eat food. So it's the gratitude that touches on our interconnectedness. Quite often we do thanks for for nature, for the farmer, for the retailer who brings us the food. And I wondered whether all that sort of reinforcement of thanks to the people that do bring us nutrition somehow blind us to the suffering involved in producing foods. So as I studied more and more about food supply and food chains, realizing how the suffering occurs along the way, not just for animals, but also in the food processing industry, where people are treated very poorly. It's very low pay, quite often with few defenses. So I didn't want to I realized that I was emotionally attached to the eating rituals that were defending the foods that I was eating. But most importantly, I think it's very hard to discuss food because what you put in your body is a very personal act. It's primal. I mean, I don't think we're very comfortable about it because there's an erotic nature to food. And some people say, oh, where's Hugh going now? Well, the definition of the root term eros is the sum of life-preserving instincts that are manifested as impulses to gratify basic needs. Eros is often equated as a form of universal life energy, whether it's describing sex or eating. Eros includes intimate blurring of boundaries, and eating blurs the boundaries between our human body and other living entities, whether they're animal or vegetable. I found an article called Eating as an Intimate Act by Don Skiff, and he writes, mundane as it may seem, we take food into our bodies as an incredibly close and intimate way by chewing it up into a liquid mass. Our food is transformed from a life form to an unrecognizable, nearly homogeneous mush. To be mindful of that fact is to acknowledge something profound. It not only recognizes the part of other people play in growing and processing our food, it also recognizes the intimate sharing of life forms in the process we call life itself. So eating is both commonly public and intensely private. So I don't think there's any surprise that we stumble over trying to deal with this. But as we try to work towards a more compassionate approach to our eating habits, for me, it's not that we have to be all at the same space, but that we're going in the same direction. And all that in that direction is simply towards a less harming, a less suffering producing type of behavior in our nutrition choices. I do want to throw these two out, and then we'll open up the mics because I have a friend who bow hunts for deer, and I do feel different about the way because he does, there's a certain ritual about it. He doesn't take more food than he can eat. He makes sure it goes to his family or his soup kitchens. And I'm repulsed by the idea of bow hunting. But it's certainly, to me, factoring farming is almost so opposite that. So do either of you feel less ethical hesitation towards whether it's small farming where the animals are treated better, or hunting where death is relatively quick? And then we'll open up the mics for people.
Do you want to take this, Jamie?
Yeah, so it's clear that there's a broad range of different ways of farming and hunting, and some are worse than others, that's clear. And I think almost everybody would agree that industrial factory farming is probably the dark heart of that in terms of the length of life, the living conditions, and the slaughterhouses. There's been some interesting work by Sentientism Institute recently that showed that around almost half of US adults would actually be in favor of banning slaughterhouses, banning factory farming completely. So I think even amongst the vast majority of the population who consume meat, dairy, and eggs, many people are actually against factory farming. So I think that's something that there's a strong point of commonality between vegans and people who consume animal products. So they're certainly less harmful and more harmful. But what I would say is that as soon as you switch to considering the perspective of the victim, that does put even the nicest sort of family farm, in inverted commas, or the most reverential hunting practice in a very different context. Because if you imagine being the deer or one of their family members, or if you imagine being an animal on a supposed family farm that's free range and high welfare, as they're still separated from families, as they still often go through mutilation processes without anesthetic that are standard even on the nicest family farm, and as they still end up in the same slaughterhouse process at the end of their short lives, even there, I think there is a clear line to be drawn in the sand. So on the one hand, I'd say, even the purest of pure vegans is not in some sense perfect. As you said, Hugh, it's almost unavoidable. We're going to cause some harm in our lives. But at the same time, there does seem to be quite clear line to draw for me around an action that explicitly and needlessly causes harm and suffering to a sentient being, such that the victim or a product from their body is on the plate in front of you, whether that's done through hunting, a small family farm, or a massive industrial commercial farm. And I think one of the, sorry, I'll stop going on. One of the important things about the factory farming is many people say, I'm against factory farming, but I don't buy from it. The sad fact is everybody does, because that is, in the US, 99% of animal products, not just the steaks and the eggs and the dairy products you buy, but the ingredients that are in other products. Nearly all of it comes from factory farming. So it's extremely hard to avoid factory farm products, even if that's all you object to. So I'm trying to push you more towards the victim's view, I guess.
I think also we have to remember that, especially livestock, these mammals that we eat, and birds as well, are social animals. I mean, when we talk about the pecking order, it's because birds have a very, very sophisticated social orders. And pigs love their children and their families. And when some of them are slaughtered, think about the pain. Think about the pain, the grief that we feel when we lose a family member. So I can't imagine it's that different.
I hear you. So we're going to open it up to questions from the floor, and some folks came late. I tried to emphasize that we're trying to learn here, so we're not necessarily going to convince each other. But if you have, please try to keep your comments short. You can raise your hand in the raise the hand app. You can also wave at the screen, and we'll try to notice you if you have a question for Jamie or Amy. Yes,
I'm
Amy,
also
go
going
ahead.
to take a point of privilege and answer
Yep.
my mother's question in the
Yep.
chat. So I think that it's very important to keep in mind with everything we do as ethical culturists that we don't want to create a classist system here. Okay. And if in fact we go along, we say, okay, well, we can only have grass-fed cows doesn't mean a whole lot because most of them graze before they are put into the factory farms, but we want grass finished, right? Aside from the fact that I don't think we should be unnecessarily slaughtering cows regardless, who can afford that? Who can afford to pay $20 a pound for meat? I mean, now we are really creating a classist food system, which is something I don't think we want. I think so that, and of course, we just don't have enough land on which to graze animals if in fact we wanted all the animals that we eat to be raised in family farms. And as well, there's a good argument to be made that it's even worse for the planet because it takes a longer time. If you're not putting animals in factory farms, if you're letting them grow up naturally, it's going to take a whole lot longer for them to get to slaughter weight, which means that it's going to do a whole lot more damage to the planet. So just throw that. And I do think it's very important to make fresh foods, fresh produce available to everyone. And there are some ways, obviously one obvious way we can do that is to stop subsidizing factory farms and start subsidizing plants and vegetables. I have begun working on the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill comes up for renewal in 2023. This being an election year, we're not getting a lot of legislation passed federally. So some of us have begun to work on some lobbying efforts for a fairer and more humane Farm Bill.
That's a federal bill.
Yes, the Farm Bill, it's renewed every 5 years.
Gotcha.
And that's where they just,
Okay, so I see Stuart has a hand. I saw your chat, Stuart. You can't ask all those questions. What's your question or point you'd like to make, Stuart? You can unmute yourself.
First, let's put people first, not animals, okay?
Okay.
I mean, would you rather, when you look at the grocery stores and the inflation, you're going to really, if you do what you say, it's going to skyrocket the price of meat. The lower economic tier will not be able to afford proper food. What we need is nutrition education, not so much for welfare animals, but to help our health and to help people who really have trouble affording food doing it. We also have to look at how we're using our farm land. 40% of our corn crop is used to make ethanol, totally for cars, totally inefficient. You're better off burning straight gasoline, and that's purely done as a backdoor farm subsidy.
I hear that. So the point you made about the expense and the fact that it's sometimes harder to finance vegan or vegetarian diets. Amy was talking about that. I don't know whether, Jamie, you want to add any more to that.
Yeah, it's interesting to take a global perspective, because when you look around the world, actually the US, the UK and Europe, we're the outliers, right? We're the strange people who've got this massive industrial factory farming. If you look at India or China, although sadly they're sort of following our path now, or most of Africa, most people are much closer to a vegan diet than we are. And that's partly because if you look at the sort of meat alternatives, if you like, the cultured meat that's coming through now, or the fermented meat, or the Impossible Burgers, or the Beyond Burgers, those are at the moment more expensive. So there's a real challenge there, right? How can we expect people to buy the more expensive burger when they can't afford it? So that's an absolutely valid challenge. But actually, if people have at least the basic capability of cooking and access to a wide range of fruits, vegetables, and pulses, a vegan diet on average can be 30 to 35% cheaper than the average omnivore diet. That does require the ability to do some basic cooking and so on, and not everybody has that. So that is absolutely a challenge. I'm not papering over it, but in simple terms, globally, the rest of the world are much closer to veganism than we already are, and they're much poorer than we are. And even in our civilizations, a vegan diet generally is, a quarter to a third cheaper than a normal omnivore diet. But you made another really important point, Stuart, about effectiveness and, using grains and crops for ethanol, for example. One of the other massive inefficiencies that I learned about as I've been working through this is how much of our crops are actually fed to animals instead of being used for animal feed. So most of the deforestation that's been driven in Southern America, for example, a lot of that is through clearing land for growing soy. That soy is not being eaten by vegans or or vegetarians or even omnivores. It's 78% of it is being fed to animals, farmed animals. And when you feed that soy through a farmed animal, you lose nearly all of its nutritional value. You keep, depending on the breed of the animal, 5 to 10% of its nutritional value. So in the similar point you made about ethanol, there's a massive inefficiency built in to feeding vast amounts of often human edible plants through animals and getting almost nothing out at the other end. And that links back to the climate question that I know came up earlier on, because of that sheer scale of waste that is at the center of animal agriculture, the amount of energy and calories and nutrition that is basically just turned into, frankly, shit and piss and heat and energy and things we can't use through feeding them through animals. That's what drives the land use. That's what drives the water use. That's what drives the pollution. That's what drives the emissions and CO2 and CH4. And it's a little shocking to get your head around this, but when you run the numbers, and I know this isn't going to happen, if everyone switched completely to plant-based foods, we could free up 3/4 of all the agricultural land on the planet. That's like freeing up a continent and a half for rewilding or solar or wind or whatever else we want to do with it. It's just a breathtaking scale of land usage through animal agriculture. And that also links to a population question that was asked earlier on, right? I don't think it's the population of humans that's so much the problem. It's the 100 billion land animals, really, that's the population problem we've got to
address. One reason that I'm actually wanting to see space colonized.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because in space, you could build a large space station or a base on the moon. You ain't going to raise too many animals, except maybe for fish. On Mars.
Let me go to Mike Stewart.
The Mars colony will be vegan. There's no way they will have animal agriculture. It's so wasteful. They just cannot afford it. Nor can we.
Mike French.
Yeah. A promotion and then one of my dilemmas. I've been vegan for decades, so I have no issue with that. But I was going to say on the communal thing, folks we have an ethical culture resource in the short-lived Ethical Culture Journal. There was an environmental issue, and I know in my essay in that I talked about how societies can do more for their potluck dinners and lunches and such, to move things more in a vegetarian and vegan way, in a way that's not sort of intrusive on others. So I refer people to that. My dilemmas here are not regarding food, but clothing. And I don't use leather, but I do use wool. And, this is one of the reasons I have this wool vest on here. I've gone to that because the synthetic vests, you've got the problems of the micropollution and all that, and but I know that my wool is also the product of suffering and of the same factory system. The sheep that provides the wool probably is going to eventually end up as mutton, And so I don't know what the solution to that particular dilemma, or my dilemma in having to feed my cat food that's meat, because if I don't, they go blind.
Mhm. I'm afraid I don't have a solution to either one of those problems. There is a lot of controversy about cats and whether vegan food, whether cats can be properly nourished by vegan food, but as a dog companion, I don't really have the answers. Yeah, and as far as clothing, there's always cotton.
Anything on that, Jamie?
Yeah, I think there is a theme that doesn't give a magical answer to both, but helps with many of these problems, which is, again, I think if we shift to this sentientist perspective, and I think you probably already have it, Mike, if you've been a vegan for decades, is it will also drive the development of our technology in a way that can help resolve some of these situations too. And I think it's important to watch out for this sort of reverence for nature that can sometimes blind us to positive technological ways forward. So there is a sense that wool is, a natural thing, so it must be better than the synthetic fabrics. But I think when you look at the environmental problems of the animal farming, as well as the suffering, compare that with a lifetime of a synthetic product, often the synthetic product might actually turn out to be better even environmentally as well as ethically. So I think it's worth just having a clear scientific mindset as we look at these things and not get trapped by thinking that something natural is necessarily the best answer. I mean, one other example is, everyone hates landfills, but the latest research shows that if they're actually really well managed, they can act as carbon sinks. There's been a lot of noise around GMO foods, but again, people have a reaction to them that I don't think is well substantiated by the scientific evidence. So we've just got to be a little bit careful, because I think there are scientific ways forward. And that certainly applies, I think, in cat food too. So there are 3 or 4 commercially available cat foods at the moment that have synthesized taurine and all of the synthesized nutrients that cats require, because they are obligate carnivores. It is at an earlier stage of development. I would defer to veterinary advice. But again, I do think that's another thing that technology will solve. And we'll see it in human foods too. We're already seeing, I don't know who's tried an Impossible Burger or the vegan version of a KFC or the McDonald's plant burger, or, these products, certainly for the shaped product, burgers, nuggets, pieces, to my mind, are almost indistinguishable from the real thing. And as cultivated meat develops, that's going to become even more compelling and even more price competitive as well. So I think technology is one of the things that's really going to help resolve some of these situations.
We have 2 more questions, Kurt Collier, and then Paulo, you'll wrap it up for us tonight. Kurt?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now.
Okay, great. Thank you. I guess I want to start off by saying that there's so much, of course, that I would be in agreement with what's been said tonight. I am not a humanist. I'm a biocentrist. And I think my question to you is a philosophical one, that do we need to add sentientism, I guess is the pronunciation of that. I think that's, from a biocentrist perspective, I think that still is where you're putting, it's somewhat anthropocentric, because you're putting a extra human value on something called sentience, whereas the biocentrist, we would focus on the biome, right? And so it has, our focus is on that. So for example, I'm an environmentalist, so the way we have to deal with invasive ecologies and the massive amounts of animals who are now where they should no longer be. And so sentientism, if it says that I cannot kill anything that has consciousness, then I can't be an environmentalist the way that the environmentalism works, which is to reestablish the biome. So my question really is to you, is we can do all the things that we've said here. I mean, I'm against factory farming. I'm a sustainitarian myself, but I can certainly understand veganism and would promote it. I just don't understand to say, why do we need the philosophical layer of sentientism on top of that?
That sounds like yours, Jamie.
Yeah, so to start with the point of commonality, I think I'm quite a strict sentientist, and I think that all value ultimately comes back to the experiences of sentient beings. But where that takes me anyway is to a rich sense of environmental concern, because having a healthy planet and healthy ecosystems is critically important for all the sentient beings that live on it. So that's why I think even a sentientist stance still has an enormous amount in common with an environmental worldview and a concern that goes more broadly. And I guess I'm reasonably comfortable if people want to go beyond sentience and say, look, even plants, for example, or rocks and rivers and trees and ecosystems and the earth as Gaia warrant direct moral consideration too. For me, that's only indirect. But if people want to grant that direct moral consideration, I'm reasonably comfortable with that, as long as none of the sentient beings get excluded. Because what often tends to happen, and I think this might be a little unfair, but it feels to me that it's the center of gravity of the current environmental movement, is it's really that has the anthropocentric human-centered view. So humans have gone from, we care about all humans, that's great. We're now threatened by an environmental crisis, and we want a nice environment to live in terms of ecosystem services and aesthetics. So we're now going to jump from a human concern to a broad concern about the environment we all share. But often, and I'm not saying this is true of Kurt, but often that environmental concern is still driven really by a human concern, a human aesthetic concern, and a human survival concern, and a human concern for the place we want to live. So, and often that can lead to a brutal disregard for many sentient beings in the wild, and it can lead for a brutal disregard for farmed animals. So someone who has a broad environmental consciousness but still supports animal farming in any form, I'm not sure that's consistent. Whereas someone who recognizes the moral significance of all sentient beings and wants to go further, I'm more comfortable. And I'd say again that sentientism doesn't say there are no circumstances in which it's justifiable to kill a sentient being, just as humanism doesn't say there's no circumstances where it's justifiable to kill a human. We can all imagine thought experiments where it might be a horrible thing to do, but it's, you can imagine it being justifiable. Mm-hmm. But let's not approach those lightly. Again, the default environmental movement's stance is if an animal causes problems, let's kill them. And I just suggest a more compassionate conservationism that says, yes, we care about the environment, but let's also bear in mind every individual that has the capacity to suffer in that system as well. So I think there's overlap there, but there are differences.
I'll go to Paula, but I just want to say, Kurt, I'd love to have you back and let's do a biocentrist discussion. I'd like to get more involved in that. Paula, you got the last question.
Oh no. As a vegan for over 40 years, I have made my choices really simple. And when you add a layer of sentientism, I find myself asking, wait a minute, are silkworms sentient? So now I can buy silk? I mean, my partner Ben thinks I'm just great because I won't buy silk, I won't buy wool, I'm saving thousands of dollars. So how do you add another layer?
Well, I don't think it's actually adding another layer. I think that when we look at why we are vegan in the first place, it's out of reason and compassion. And the more we learn, the more we reconsider our actions. I mean, that's something that that we take, I think, from John Dewey, that we make. It does complicate things. I mean, I think what you're saying is you thought that if it's made from an animal, forget it. And you know what? That's how I run. I operate as well. Keeps it simple. Yeah, no silk, no. And if we're saying that at some point, scientists may discover that silkworms are not sentient, so be it. Right. But we don't have that knowledge now anyway.
Yeah, I mean, for the moment, I think the science is unclear. I give them the benefit of the doubt, so that's going to keep saving Ben money for the moment. And I think not harming animals is a really good rule of thumb. If you like, sentientism is just a little bit more precise about why is that? And I think it overlaps with veganism. Most veganism is about trying to cause suffering, and only sentient beings can suffer. So in a sense, there's a close overlap. But there are some boundary cases. I mentioned sea sponges earlier on. They're taxonomically called animals, highly unlikely to be sentient. And I know we're not going to cover this topic now, but I think sentientism also makes it future-proof, because you might conceptually be able to imagine artificial or even alien sentience at some point that aren't animals, they aren't biological, and we should be ready to recognize the salience of their suffering too, but that's a different topic.
Well, I know we could go on for a long time. There are a lot of questions in the chat. We're going to save the chat. We might be able to get you some answers. All of you here tonight will get some information sent to you within 2 days from Jamie, Amy, and me. I think, though, I want to keep us to I'm a bit of a stickler on trying to keep to our schedule. So I want to just say, remember, this was sponsored by the Ethical Action Committee of the American Ethical Union and the American Ethical Union. I want to thank Carolyn Parker, the chair of the committee, and others on the committee for helping frame this. Jake, Bart, for helping with tonight's program. Amy, thank you for getting me to do this. You were the stick that stirred this drink. And Jamie, thank you for being up at 1:30 a.m. in North London to do this with us. I really, really appreciate it. Again,
It's such a pleasure.
Yeah,
And the only quick thing I'd say is that I think humanists and ethical culture have led social justice movements from the start. Using evidence and reason to challenge harmful social norms and find a more compassionate way forward. And to my mind, this is just the next frontier. So it's such a privilege to talk to you all.
Thank you, Jamie, very much. And I signed up to be on the Sentientism Facebook feed, so I'm getting interesting articles. So consider doing that. We'll send out all that links, information. And remember, if we're going to do something with this, one opportunity is to go ahead and email Amy at ethicalschools.org. I just put it in the chat, and she is going to quarterback the potential drawing up of a resolution that might come before the American Ethical Union. We'll see, Amy. Fingers crossed. But at the very least, let's do something. And being together in a community is how we try to make ethical progress. And that means taking into consideration the fact that they're all different. We're all at different spaces regarding this topic. But at least we realize that there's a reason to try to talk about that. And that is that we know suffering is bad.
Yeah.
Anything else, Bart, before we sign off?
Just thank you all for coming out and for putting your time and energy into this night. It's been a good time. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.